All right. Do a brief introduction, and we're going to do kind of a box fight. We'll do a combined, like, small seminar here, and then assuming we got a big audience online. All right. Welcome, everybody. Greetings. I'm Ed Steinfeld. I'm the director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. I am so thrilled today to welcome Jeff Shesol to back to Brown, and welcome, Jeff, welcome you to Watson. And it's a little strange in a way. We're in this kind of period of transition where we've been accustomed over the past 18 months to have our big audiences online, which we still have, but I'm thrilled, of course, to say that we're also transitioning to in-person events. So I'm really delighted that we can have a small seminar-like setting in person here, and then we have our audience online as well. Welcome to everybody. So of course, today's special event is focused on the book Mercury Rising. Phenomenal book. I recommend it to those of you who haven't read it, and for those of you who have read it, you probably want to read it again. Let me just say a few words by way of introduction. Jeff Shesol is a person of many creative talents. He's a historian, of course. He's the author not just of Mercury Rising, but also of Supreme Power, Franklin Roosevelt versus the Supreme Court, and also the book Mutual Contempt, Lyndon Johnson, Robert Kennedy, and the Feud That Defined a Decade. Jeff served previously as a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton, and Jeff took the lead role in writing two State of the Union addresses, President Clinton's 2000 speech to the Democratic National Convention, and also President Clinton's farewell address. From 1994 to 1998, Jeff wrote the nationally syndicated comic strip Thatch. I'm a big fan. Prior to that, Jeff was an undergraduate here at Brown. He's a graduate of the class of 1991, and right after that attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Jeff is currently a partner at Westwing Writers, which is, as many of you know, a speech writing and strategy firm in Washington, D.C. The way we're going to set things up today is I'm about to ask Jeff to provide a brief overview of Mercury Rising, and then I'm going to turn it over to a conversation between Jim Head and Jeff Shesol. So let me just say a word about Jim Head, who, as many of you know, is one of Brown's own. Jim is the Lewis and Elizabeth Scherck Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Geological Sciences and Professor of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences. Jim is a really world-leading expert on topics of planetary evolution and the role of volcanism and tectonism in the formation of planetary crusts, all relevant to the current discussion. But what's particularly relevant is that earlier in his career, Jim worked at NASA in the Apollo program, in the Apollo lunar exploration program. Jim was involved as a geologist in lunar site selection, in exploration strategy, in the training of all of the Apollo astronauts, and involved in the analysis of return samples, but work that continues today with samples returned not just from the US program, but from global programs, including the Chinese program. So with that, let me turn the discussion first over to you, Jeff. You'll talk for a few minutes, and then we're going to do a conversation between the two of you, maybe the three of us for a little bit, and then we'll just open it up to the audience. So again, Jeff Shesol.
Now, if you can hear me through this mask and through this microphone, then we're off to a good start technologically. Thanks very much, Ed, for the introduction. It's thrilling for me to be here with you and Jim here with you. As I mentioned when we first began talking about doing this, I'd like to turn the tables, and I'm sure I will at some point in this conversation because I have a lot of questions for you.
Okay.
But I will hold on to the microphone for just a minute. Also, I'm glad to say that my wife, Rebecca Epstein, class of 92, is here as well, and our kids, Jonah and Anna, who have heard me talk about John Glenn more than they probably care to recall. But here we go again. I will also note that we speak today on the site of the former diner Beef and Bun. Any of you who were here at the time will miss it as well, but this is a fine facility, and if you're going to tear down the Beef and Bun, this is a pretty good reason. So I'll just talk for a few minutes before we open up the discussion about why I decided to write this book, Mercury Rising. This is certainly not the first time anybody's told the story of John Glenn and Friendship 7, the first orbital flight. And I remembered, and this is something that I've thought about very consciously, each time I've sat down to write a book. That makes it sound like I've written more than 3 books, but I have written now 3 books. And that is, I think of the words of Jack Thomas, who was a legendary history professor here, and he led a thesis writing seminar. And he would insist, we would come to him with all of these wonderful ideas about what we wanted to write a thesis about. And Jack Thomas would say, what is the historical question that you are trying to answer? And we were usually stumped and had to go back and think a bit more about that. And sometimes there really wasn't one, and we needed to go back to the drawing board. Other times you had to sort of dig through your own thinking to try to understand why you were drawn to this subject. On a certain level, it's obvious. This is an incredibly exciting story, the space race. It doesn't need any help from me to make it exciting. But I realized that the reason that I wanted to write about John Glenn and about this flight in particular was because, to be honest, I never was quite sure why it was such a big deal. I knew that John Glenn was a big deal, and at the time I was thinking about this. He was a United States senator in his 4th term. I was certainly aware that he was the first American to orbit the Earth, but he was not the first person to orbit the Earth. 2 Russians had done it before John Glenn had done it. And he was not the first American in space. He was the 3rd American in space. So what was it about John Glenn's flight that seemed to elevate it above really any other Mercury flight, certainly, and perhaps, and Jim, I'd be eager for your view on this, really in terms of the impact of it globally, greater than any other space flight until Apollo 11. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to understand why that would possibly be the case. And as I dug into it, and coming at it not as an engineer, but as a political historian, it became clear to me that this really was at its heart a Cold War story. And this is not news. I think that most people understand. They certainly understood then that the space race was a Cold War contest between the US and the Soviet Union. And yet it tends to be relegated to the sidelines of that larger story. And if you have a shelf full of Cold War books, as I do, very few of them do anything more than mention the space race. They're more focused, as you would expect them to be, on Cuba, on the other theaters of the Cold War, of Berlin and Southeast Asia. And space, maybe gets a mention. And the same, frankly, is true of a lot of wonderful books about space and about the space race. The Cold War exists as kind of atmosphere, as kind of context, but really more background noise than anything else. And so as I began to try as best I could to see these events as they were seen at the time, as they existed, as they passed by on the screen of John F. Kennedy, for example, they really are part of the same story. And the Cold War and the space race existed in the same frame. And I think that if you want to understand why the space race felt so significant in that moment, if you want to understand why 4 million Americans came out in the streets of New York in the bitter cold at the beginning of March 1962 to cheer John Glenn after his successful flight, if you want to understand why President Kennedy made the decision, which he was not inclined to make, to go to the moon and to give Jim Head a job and a lifetime's worth of stories. You have to see it for what it was, which was an integral part of the Cold War struggle. And we can talk a little bit about that, but I just wanted to set that up as a frame. And I think that restoring, as I said, those two storylines to the same picture is really what my mission was. And that was the historical question that I sought to answer here. You can, if you read the book, I hope you will, you can be the judge whether I've answered it to your satisfaction. Thanks very much. I'm happy to go wherever you lead.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Sound okay? Okay, great. So, I think this is really interesting. I'll just pick up on your last point there that thank God the decision was made because it gave me a job. Otherwise, I don't know what I'd be doing today. Actually, I still don't know what I want to do when I grow up, but we'll work on that later. But the key here is that, I think I also always toast the Russians when we have these great dinners in their homes and lots of vodka goes down. I always say, thank you for Sputnik because that paid for my graduate education. I was employed as a graduate student under the National Defense Education Act. That was my fellowship. And to do what? To look at limestones in the Appalachians because they wanted to, this was a response. We didn't have enough science. And it was a really incredible kind of basic, kind of like an injection of energy and funding and enthusiasm of science into the educational system. But that's just, that's important. It's an important part of the story. But, I think for me, I just reflect back having read Jeff's book and listened to him talk here. When I was in 6th grade, basically, the teacher asked the question, Mrs. Tennyson, as I remember, she said, what is the best history? One that's written at the time of the events or one that's written 50 years later? And I said, well, obviously one that's written at the time of the events because everybody's still around. They know what happened. 50 years later, who's left to, well, I should say I'm still left. Okay. But anyway, 50 years after Apollo, but who's left that knew what really went on? And she said, no, it's the one that's written 50 years later because they have perspective on things. And to this day, except till I read this book, I said, I don't believe that because I've watched Apollo be retold as a history. And it's hysterical to listen to people tell me how it worked. And I said, actually, I don't remember any of that. No, none of that. So history does get rewritten, and it gets rewritten in a way that is interpreted in the context of the current culture or other things. My point here is that Jeff wrote a book which convinced me that she was right. Okay. His blending together of all this fabric of events is really what she was talking about. Basically, you get perspective on it. You go back and you ask new questions, fundamental questions that, maybe I didn't experience, et cetera. And that has really added an incredible value from my perspective on what this part of the space program was all about. So I want to thank you for proving my 6th grade teacher correct.
Thank you.
And it's really an incredible contribution. And I think, I'd like to probe a little bit about what the situation was like at that time and why indeed John Glenn's flight, Friendship 7, was so important. How do you account for all these people, 4 million people coming out in the cold? What nerve did that in the American culture or just national pride was essentially touched by that? And how did that work? I mean,
well, thanks, Jim. It really begins where you've put the pin down, and that is Sputnik. That Sputnik touched off a kind of rolling panic on the part of the American public and American policymakers. Not just that we had to match this accomplishment, but that it seemed to reveal the weaknesses of American society in the post-war period. There had been a creeping sense among some thinkers, religious thinkers and intellectuals and others in the public policy arena, that America had lost its edge since World War II, that it had lost its boldness, its sense of initiative, and that it was growing complacent in its consumerism, that all of the wealth that had been generated in the United States and the consumer goods that were being produced in the United States in the post-war period were making people very, very happy, but very complacent. And that we had fallen in love with our cars, our big cars, and our color televisions. And meanwhile, the Russians were creating scientists and engineers at an unbelievable pace. And so when Sputnik went up, it tapped into something that pre-existed it, and touched it off in a very powerful way. And so the self-loathing and the anxiety that was released in that moment was very profound, and a sense that America had let something slip and that it was not easily going to be gained back. There was a joke at the time that the Russians would never learn how to smuggle an atomic weapon in a suitcase because they couldn't build a good enough suitcase. That was the patronizing tone of most Americans' view of Soviet science in this period of time. But then they had just done this spectacular thing. And then they did another spectacular thing, one after another. They didn't just have the first satellite in space, but then they, in short order, sent the first animal into space, the dog, Laika. They sent the first spacecraft to the moon, crash landed by design into the moon. They sent a spacecraft around the far side of the moon to photograph it, which had never been done before. It was one thing after another. And the self-flagellation, as I said, was intense here in the United States. And we had a president at the time, Dwight D. Eisenhower, who did not seem to match the mood or the mission of the moment and tended to regard space as somewhat silly. He was interested in reconnaissance satellites because those might guard against a surprise nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. But he was not interested in space exploration, and he made this very plain. He called it kid stuff. He said, "We don't have any enemies on the moon." So as far as he was concerned, there was not really any reason to go there. And so the United States was behind, and we did not at that time have a president who was determined to catch up or was all that convinced that there was any reason to bother.
That's really interesting. And another perspective on that is actually how it did mobilize people in response. I think you're right about it's have we become such a soft culture that our leadership is being lost. I mean, I don't think anyone believed communism was a better system. It's just that, by comparison, look at the accomplishments. Let them speak for themselves. And, it's interesting to me that what it did awaken in part was, to me anyway, when Kennedy made his speech and I was coming out of graduate school and coming in graduate school, actually, we said, gee, I need a job, as you were saying. And so I got this college placement annual. It's a book of jobs, and turned it to a certain page. And it said, geologist at 15 to 27 and 46. And, what's that outlier? So I looked on page 46 and there was a picture of the moon, and it said simply, our job is to think our way to the moon and back. Call this number. And I go, how could you not call that number? What's that all about? And I got the job. And the thing is that, throughout Apollo, it was at least as much, I think, politically, it was about beating the Russians. But for us who were involved, it was about, can we meet that challenge? And I think this is a key part. It also described in your book, I think, well, the perspective of pride and prestige, where pride is how we view ourselves, okay, and prestige is how others view us. For us in the Apollo program, it was much more about, essentially, our how we view ourselves. And I don't mean pride as arrogance. I just mean it as, are we the fat TV loving, large winged car driving people or what? And I think throughout the Apollo program, that was incredible. And I think that's, by gosh, we did it. And that was a great boost, not only for our pride, but for prestige. That was a highlight of U.S., I think, reputation in the world, basically. And we took everybody along with us. One small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Everybody came along with us, and that was incredible.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's fascinating that you say that was the perspective from within NASA, because there's a quote I added at the beginning of the book from Jim Webb, who was the administrator of NASA during this early period. And the day after the Soviets succeeded in sending the first human being into space, Yuri Gagarin, in April of 1961, Webb happened to be testifying on Capitol Hill, arguing for a budget increase for NASA. And something he said really jumped out at me in exactly the same light, Jim, that you've just described. And that is, he said, what we are doing here in the United States is having a good hard look at how a great nation faces a great problem.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of whether the nation had the capability to do something as significant as get to the moon was something that said a lot to Americans about their own capabilities, but also said a lot to those around the world who were looking at the United States, looking at that other system to see which indeed was the wave of the future.
Yeah, and I think that's the same thing we actually face with China right this very minute. Okay, so that's another perspective, maybe another book. Okay. But I think one of the interesting things about, and I appreciate your perspective on this for sure, is that Sergei Khrushchev, who was the son of Nikita Khrushchev and a fellow here at the Watson Institute, told me one time that when Kennedy proposed this speech to land a human on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade, there were actually negotiations to ask the Russians to join in, to participate. It's a little known fact, but Sergei, love his stories. Oh gosh, he said, "Oh, Dad, my father was like, what am I going to do? They'll find out we don't have anything. I can't accept that, blah, blah, blah." It was really hysterical to listen to the bemoaning about what to do, how to respond to the Americans. And eventually, of course, they said no. And they weren't successful because they had a very complex rocket and a lot of other things that we could go into at another time. But how did that play out in the rest of the arena when you see how the early U.S. failures, like rockets blowing up and beautiful balls of fire on the launch pad, et cetera, how did that recovery play out in the politics and the Eisenhower / Kennedy transition? Did that start to really turn the stage? I mean,
Well, it was one of the elements that did. And I mean, first, before turning to domestic politics, just looking at geopolitics for a second in terms of how it was perceived around the world, the U.S. failures were, again, not simply seen as a failure of a rocket that blew up on the launch pad or the failure of a space program that was not apparently the equal of the Soviet Union, but again, the failure of this larger system and its ability to meet the tests of the 20th century. There was a very real question, not just in the United States, but across the free world, whether democracy was really built to meet the tests of the atomic age, or whether there were simply strengths to a totalitarian system and its ability to marshal all of its resources toward a great goal that would indeed allow the Soviet Union to surpass the United States, not just in space, but on the Earth. There was a poll taken in late 1960 of America's allies in Western Europe. So Britain, France, and West Germany primarily. And the people of those countries were asked, which of the two superpowers will be ahead militarily in 10 years' time? And by a margin of 2-1, our own allies said the Soviet Union would be ahead militarily. And the reason for that was the Soviet lead in space, because it was seen to be the same technology. It wasn't, in fact, the same technology. I mean, as far as most of the public was concerned, a rocket is a rocket, a missile is a missile. It wasn't as simple as that. But there was something incredibly powerful about what the Soviets were doing in space. And so Kennedy, when he began to talk about the challenge, made clear to the public that this wasn't just about going to the moon because it was there. That this was a test of the system with the eyes of the world upon us, with profound implications for our national security. And that was how he saw it. And that was indeed how people already saw it across the free world. But you asked about domestic politics. And Kennedy saw a real opportunity on this issue in 1960. He said that if the Soviets control space, they will control life here on Earth, and that we will be seen not only as second in space, but second in science and technology broadly, second in military power, second in this larger struggle, and that it would be dangerous to allow this to continue to happen. To him, it was a perfect opportunity to paint not only Eisenhower, but his vice president, Nixon, who was running for president against Kennedy, as, again, essentially falling asleep at the switch while the Soviets were posing this profound challenge. The problem was that Kennedy then entered office without a plan to make America first in space, and without a feeling really yet that it was one of the main things that he had to do when he was facing challenges in Berlin, when he was facing challenges in Southeast Asia and in the other parts of the world that we discussed, as well as problems here at home. So Kennedy temporized on the issue until the Soviets forced his hand by sending Gagarin into space.
It's really interesting. And, again, I just, it's deja vu all over again, as Yogi Berra would say, in the sense that the Chinese space program is now, starting to absolutely produce a similar kind of thing. It's not, people say, is there a Chinese-US space race? Well, I think you got to take a broader view than that. And when we think about this, and basically the question is the economic system that the Chinese are engaged in, better than ours? And what does that produce in a culture? What does that produce in benefit? So I think we'll all see in the near future here the same sort of thing playing out. Okay, as we lurch into the next decade. So I think what I'd really like to hear about is John Glenn, the person. I think many of us have dreamed about going into space. Maybe it's a nightmare. Maybe it's like planting the flag. Maybe it's finding some good rocks or things on the surface, et cetera, as a geologist. But the question is, what were his motivations? What were his motivations, and how did that play out in his personal feelings, et cetera? And he's one of the first people, the Friendship 7 and the Mercury 7 astronauts. How does that balance out with personality as well as ambition? And you write very well about those elements. And could you summarize for us how that kind of played out? And fear is part of that. I think, a human being. Okay, just a few.
Well, I think that one of the reasons that Glenn is an interesting figure, and particularly interesting in the context of the other Mercury 7 astronauts, is that he really did see the whole picture. There was a context that was clear to John Glenn that wasn't quite as clear to the other astronauts, or they weren't able to articulate it as well as Glenn, or they weren't as conscious of it as Glenn. And by the whole picture, what I mean is that Glenn certainly understood this as a national security challenge. And he was a Marine pilot. I mean, he had spent most of his life in the military, and then he had been a military test pilot. And so this was part of the Cold War contest. He saw that. That was very clear to him. He also was, and this is more on the personal level, he was an extraordinarily competitive individual. Of course, they all were. But Glenn was someone who wore it very lightly, so it's easy to miss. If you are old enough to remember him as a senator, which a couple of us, Mark, a couple of us are, or if you have at least seen the films about the era, whether documentary films or the fictional treatments of it. Glenn is sort of an aw shucks homespun guy from an extremely small town in southeastern Ohio, New Concord. And this was his authentic personality. And yet at the same time, and this is why I find him such an interesting person, at the same time, he was intensely competitive, absolutely restless on his own behalf in advancing, whether it was through the military to fly the fastest plane. And begins very early for him in World War II, where he was angling to get into combat. They wanted to put him in one of those big multi-engine planes and cargo planes, essentially. And as far as he was concerned, as he put it, this was like driving a bus. He wanted to get in those little combat planes, and he succeeded. He had to go make his case to a number of people, and he succeeded. And this is the pattern for Glenn. And so when he has essentially, in the eyes of many around him, played out his career as a pilot, he's now approaching 40 years old, and he seems to be done. And that is how others are describing him, and they're pushing him towards desk jobs that are said to be promotions, but to him, they're a kind of spiritual death to just sit at a desk when you want to be up there in the sky. He begins to hear about the space program, even before there is a space program. But there is an understanding that there are going to be attempts, whether it's by the Air Force on its own, the Navy on its own, the Army on its own, to send human beings up into space. And this is something that he wants to be part of. At a time when he seems to be sliding into middle age, he wants to make this leap into the future. And he knows, because he has this kind of self-confidence, that he's the person who can do it. So he understands that. But the other thing, and we were talking about this a little bit before we all sat down here, Glenn also really believed deeply in the scientific mission of NASA. Some of the other astronauts, to be honest, I mean, Jim, I'll be eager in your impression of the Apollo astronauts, who were much more science focused than some of the early ones. But you know, they could take it or leave it. They were hotshot pilots, and this was the most challenging thing a pilot could do, would be to go into space. And that was true for Glenn, as I was saying, but he also really was fascinated to think about this as a huge leap in humanity's scientific understanding. You know, I may or may not know this, but I mentioned this in the book, that I was going through Glenn's high school papers. Yes, this is actually something that you do when you write a book like this, particularly if your subject, like John Glenn, happens to save his high school papers. And he wrote an autobiography of himself at age 18 in that little town that I mentioned. And he's thinking about his life, the life ahead. And he wants to fly planes, but he hasn't quite figured out how that's ever going to happen. So he thinks that maybe what he wants to be is a research chemist. And this is something that's in the back of his mind for a while, until the war sort of takes him away and he becomes the pilot that he wanted to be. So Glenn was really interested in what he would see from up there. He actually lobbied, this sounds like nothing to us, but he actually lobbied unsuccessfully for a while, and then finally successfully lobbied his superiors at NASA to let him bring a camera with him on the mission. The previous two astronauts had not done that and had not asked to do that. And actually, some of the flight directors and the engineers thought an astronaut was only going to just distract himself by having a camera to operate up there. But Glenn said, this is an important part of the mission. Let's see what I can see with this camera, and let's bring that evidence back to Earth to let others see it, so they can understand what knowledge is to be gained from up there. So he was absolutely sold. And other than Scott Carpenter, there really wasn't another Mercury astronaut, in my understanding. But tell me if you feel, I mean, you knew them, so you tell me if you felt different.
I totally agree. I remember the first briefing we had for the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, and we would at Ellington Air Force Base, which is where they flew in and out of. And the question was, well, gee, okay, let's start. We're starting the training. How many people in here have a degree in geology? And no hands went up. How many people have ever had a course in geology? No hands went up. How many people ever collected rocks as a kid? No hands went up. And, okay, push the reset button here. We got work to do. And the competitiveness was a really important part of that. And I think that's, I think John Glenn in Friendship 7, not only recognized what the importance of his flight was, but as you said, hey, there's things to do up here. We're starting a new frontier, whether that is from, ego, like, okay, I'm going to be the first to do this. But my fundamental view is that it was much more that he was an explorer as well as an astronaut, and pushing that, like, that's what explorers do. So taking that camera along, you discussed how a scientist asked them to make astronomical observation. What can you see? You have to remember, nobody had ever orbited the Earth before, orbited the Earth. And that's time to sit there and look out the window, et cetera. So all of these things that he did, and that went on in his career as well, were really important from the science perspective. And the competition was really important too, just from the Apollo standpoint, going from no rocks, no courses, no nothing. They became really interested in it. And the explorers, as opposed to the space cowboys, emerged out of that. And for example, Dave Scott, the commander of the Apollo 15 mission, basically, he viewed this as a scientific expedition driven by national endeavors, national competition or whatever, but policy. He named his spacecraft after Captain Cook's ships. He told me that one of the things that inspired him was that Captain Cook actually had secret orders when he went on his voyages in the Pacific of discovery and observing Venus, and that was to plant the flag where, this is about exerting our influence in the world. Yet it was a scientific expedition. So that's exactly how he felt. And so combining that with the competition was always fun. I think somewhere early in the Apollo program, I remember getting on the elevator in the building 1 and Johnson in Houston, and riding up. A bunch of the astronauts were getting ready for some classes and stuff. And I said, in these later missions, you guys, you're going to be on the moon for like maybe 7-8 hours for each time you get out. And once you take the call from the president and plant the flag, you got 6 hours and 58 minutes. You're going to have to learn some geolingo here. And they all kind of looked at each other. Yeah, okay. So that's the competitive part. Okay, it was great. And so, yeah, I better learn. So some of them were already motivated that way, and others, like Alan Shepard, for example, on Apollo 14, one of the original Mercury astronauts, was not terribly interested in the geology. We had a lot of fun with it. We made it fun for him, but he hit the golf ball, for crying out loud. So I think that's really interesting, and I think it's a very, very strong testimony to the kind of people that did that, and also the kind of person that John Glenn was. And I was interested in there's a really good book by the first major flight director, Chris Kraft, who's a wonderful man. I just have nothing to say but the best for him. He wrote a book called Flight, which, if any of you ever want to know what it was like to go from zero to the space program, that's the book to read. We're gonna put an astronaut in orbit. We need a global communication system. We don't have one. How about that? And all these other kinds of things. Okay. In the book, Chris Kraft is not very complimentary to John Glenn, and I'm interested in your thoughts about that and where that leads us in terms of John Glenn's personality and why that was the case.
I'd love to answer that question. And before I do, I had a thought on this tension between those who were interested in the science and those who were not so interested in the science, and it actually plays out during Glenn's orbits around the Earth. He orbits the Earth 3 times in Friendship 7, and he's completing his first orbit. I believe this is when it happens, and he begins to see these little specks of illuminated something. He doesn't know what they are. He calls them fireflies, and they seem to flow around the capsule as it's speeding at, what is it, 17,500 miles an hour, a second. I think that's
an hour.
And they're floating around the capsule, and they seem to be following him and matching his speed, and some recede off into the distance. And he's spellbound by these things, and he begins to describe them to the folks at Mercury Control. And the reaction generally is sort of, okay, and so what's the level on, they're ready to move on to whatever else he was supposed to check. And Glenn is up there in space witnessing this fantastic thing that he cannot identify. And so he wants to explore it. He wants to discuss it. As he goes around again, they reappear. They go away for a while. They reappear. And he essentially says to Mercury Control, they're back. They're back. And he begins to talk about them again. And again, the reaction is, right, okay, so anyway. And you sense the frustration, the mutual frustration. There was also, to your question, Jim, there was mutual frustration between Chris Kraft and John Glenn. And a lot of it had to do with the fundamental conflict in those early years. And I sense, again, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I sense that this was less the case later on when the astronauts had more to do and more responsibility. But in those early flights, the astronauts were really not expected to do much of anything other than to report on what they were seeing, either on the control panel or out the window. These capsules were designed to fly on autopilot. And the astronauts, being some of the best test pilots the country had to offer, were not interested in just sitting in a can and looking out the window. They wanted to fly this thing. They knew they had the capability to fly this thing. And yet there was a feeling going back pre-NASA, so to the middle of the 1950s, when this began to be discussed seriously, that the only thing an astronaut could do in a capsule was screw it up. And so if you were going to have to send a human being up there, there was one engineer, prominent engineer, who described the astronauts as problem children. Why were they a problem? Because you had to keep them alive. And that was a hard thing to do. It would have been a lot easier if you didn't have to worry about that. And you were supposed to, at the same time, give them something to do that wasn't going to cause the whole thing to come crashing back to Earth or shoot off into space. So there was actually some discussion in the 1950s that the best way to handle this was to give them a shot full of sedatives before they went up into space. And thus subdued, they were less likely to push the wrong button or freak out or whatever it was that they were going to do that was going to ruin the mission. So this goes all the way back. It's embedded in the program. And a lot of the engineers who ran the Space Task Group of NASA had come out of something called PARD, the Pilotless Aircraft Research Division of the precursor of NASA, pilotless. And so there was a bias against the pilot generally. And they built a perfect spacecraft that could get itself back to Earth, even if the astronaut had blacked out or something worse had happened. And so this was the push and pull from the beginning. As soon as the astronauts were brought into the program, they insisted they wanted to fly the thing. The engineers and flight directors insisted that that should be kept to an absolute minimum. And to get to your question now, John Glenn was by far the most vocal about this. And Alan Shepard felt exactly the same way that Glenn did. They all did, but they stepped back and they let Glenn lead the fight. It was Glenn's tendency to lead a fight like that. It was a righteous fight. And he knew he had everybody behind him, but they were behind him. And so Glenn had developed a reputation with some of the higher ups at NASA as being too assertive on his own behalf and on behalf of the other astronauts. And he could be self-righteous about it. He could be prickly about it. And he made himself very unpopular with some of them. And this jumping ahead, I mean, this is one of the reasons I believe why he never got to fly again during the 1960s. Was because he did not have the support from the people who made the decision.
Yeah, I think that's really. I think everybody should find on Netflix or wherever it is these days the movie The Right Stuff, because essentially Tom Wolfe really nailed it in many ways. And this is the attitudes of the astronauts, but also the prickly aspects of that in terms of the space flight. There's a great scene in the movie which is absolutely true. Basically the first two animals that went up were not human. They were, in fact, Ham and Enos, like chimpanzees. And that was, just an insult in the astronaut corps. And they didn't even have a window early on to look out. And what's the monkey going to do? So they insisted too that they needed that hatch, the window, and it was a really important thing. It's a funny, when the book The Right Stuff, written by Tom Wolfe, was serialized in the Rolling Stone before it was published as a book. And I remember being down in the astronaut office, and I opened my briefcase and we're talking about some stuff. And one of the astronauts said, "What's that?" And there's a big title on the front, The Right Stuff. What's that? He said, I said, that's, Tom Wolfe serializing this thing he's doing. Can I borrow that? Okay. So that disappeared. I never saw it again. And every time I come down, they would bring the next thing and just open the next, Rolling Stone ahead and open my briefcase, and they're all over it. You know what I mean? I never saw another one of those again. And indeed, The Right Stuff was what it was all about. That was part of the ego thing. And I think that's a critical point you raised just in the book and treat it really well. Essentially, the national view, I mean, we're coming out of this Cold War thing. We're not actually coming out of it yet, but we need some heroes. We need some heroes, okay? Yuri Gagarin, I mean, like, my gosh, all over the place. And so John Glenn fit that to a T in so many ways, with the looks, the attitudes, the positive nature. It's kind of the all-American thing, you know what I mean? And so you really portrayed that well, and I think it's a real gift in terms of the history. And I think too that the fear aspect, I think I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about, was he afraid? What was going on? And what was another dynamic with Chris Kraft? What Friendship 7, everybody, there's the first orbit of the, oh my God, there were so many problems with that flight. Dave Scott, the Apollo 15 commander, says, Jim, the problem is we made it look too easy. So everybody thinks it's easy. It ain't easy. You know what I mean? He actually didn't say ain't. But, can you talk a little bit more about John Glenn's fears as well as, those kinds of attitudes?
Well, it's an interesting thing to talk about fear when it comes to somebody like John Glenn, because he had sought as dangerous a line of work as anybody possibly could. I mean, first of all, being a combat pilot, and then after that, being a test pilot. And, famously, these test pilots just watched, one after another go down literally in flames. There was always death around them. They would get up, go to work in the morning, and this was just part of what they faced every day, was this mortal danger. And they had developed, they were wired differently certainly than somebody like me, and they had developed ways of dealing with this. Their families also had to develop ways of dealing with this, and that could be very difficult as well. And I write about that. That was a tough thing, even for families that had been living with that fear for decades. It became a whole other thing when you took someone who had some measure of control over a plane, which still might go down, and instead, you take that person, you strap them into a titanium capsule at the top of an intercontinental ballistic missile, and then you shoot that thing into space, basically to see whether they can survive that. And that's a kind of test pilot task that none of them, including the families, had ever signed up for. And these were tough guys, these astronauts. And again, they lived with this sort of fear, but they recognized very early on that this was a whole different business. And in fact, in 1959, very shortly after they were selected and they were announced to the public, NASA brought them to the Cape to watch a test flight of one of the booster rockets. And there was press there, and it was all very exciting. And they sat in reviewing stands, and this thing went and blew up over their heads spectacularly. And they all ducked, just reflexively. They ducked. They were not in any danger. Obviously, they had set the stands far enough away, but they just watched this thing billow in clouds of orange and black. And then they all kind of looked at each other and they laughed. And Alan Shepard said, well, I hope they fix that thing before we ride on it. And they all laughed. But privately, they got together and they all said they agreed that inevitably one of them was going to die in the course of Project Mercury. And it was really just a question of which one and when. And ironically enough, none of them did die during Project Mercury. One of the Mercury astronauts, Gus Grissom, died in a fire in 1967, the fire of Apollo 1 at a training facility. And but this was something of a higher order of danger, and the lack of control was maybe the scariest thing. And so they were all very calm, and they were very confident in public, and even to some extent in private, as they acted with bravado. And Glenn wasn't any different. But Glenn was the first, as we've been discussing, to take an orbital flight. The first two Americans who went into space took suborbital flights, which were just like Jeff Bezos did, back in the summer, up, down, 15 minutes. It never actually achieves orbit. The rocket that the first two Mercury astronauts rode up briefly into space wasn't powerful enough to put them into orbit. That was going to take a more powerful ICBM called the Atlas. And the Atlas had all kinds of problems. The Atlas had so many problems that on the eve of John Glenn's flight, the president of the company that built this rocket had the press into the factory to show off, essentially, about how incredible this rocket was and how safe it was. And so the reporters said, how safe is it? And he said, well, it's extraordinarily safe. We put it through 400 different tests. How safe is it? What would you rate the reliability? And they kept pressing. I mean, he finally said 80%. 80%, meaning he was conceding to the press that there was a 1 in 5 chance that this thing was going to blow up horrifically. And so Glenn had to sit with that knowledge, and he had to sit and wait for months, because one problem after another occurred with the booster rocket, with the capsule, with the spacesuit. All manner of things associated with this flight were going wrong. And so Glenn's flight, which was supposed to happen in the fall of '61, was delayed and delayed again. It was scrubbed. The flight was scrubbed 10 times over the course of 4 months while Glenn sat and waited. And the American public stewed in its anxiety, as I was
Mhm.
describing before. The newspapers began referring to this as our national ordeal, the sense that of foreboding that obviously something's going to go really wrong here if we can't even manage to get this thing up in the air, let alone into space. And also this sense that the Soviets had already done this twice by this point, and we couldn't seem to manage it once. And so Glenn himself begins to feel some of this anxiety as he sits in isolation in the astronauts' quarters and broods about the fact that he may well become the first man to die in space.
Yeah, it's really fascinating in that sense, because those are all very real things. And it wasn't just his life that was at stake, which is plenty, but it was the reputation of the nation. I mean, we're talking about, can we really do it? And boy, there was questions about that. In fact, one of the best comments, I believe it was John Glenn who said this, I'm pretty sure. One of the reporters asked him, do you have any fear? When you're sitting on the launch pad there, what's it like? He said, well, I'm okay with it, but how would you like to be sitting on top of a rocket that's got 50,000 parts all supplied by the lowest bidder? Yeah, okay, let me get my head around it. I don't think so. And yet later on, I remember when Dave Scott got back from the moon, a couple of days later, we had a great debriefing over in his swimming pool. And I said, Dave, so that was great observations along the rill there. We were talking geology. And he said, Jim, I had so much fun doing the geology that I didn't even know I had my spacesuit on. And I'm thinking, I'd be looking over my shoulder at that Earth just to make sure it was still there. and so that's a major transition. Dave was like John Glenn in the sense of being interested in the science, and he made it a priority, and he got so into it. I think the biggest compliment I ever had was Dave Scott's wife took me aside one time. She said, Jim, you've spoiled Dave. I had to take a course at night on geology just so I could talk to him at dinner. But so there was a big transition. I think John Glenn, as beautifully shown in your book, really represented that sort of thing. Living with the danger, and that flight, Friendship 7. Go back and research that. Read the book. Oh, mon. It was like unbelievable. I mean, there were so many points of danger, and so many unusual things happened. Actually, pretty unusual things. It's the way, yeah. So congratulations on a really great book. And again, thank you for redeeming my sixth grade teacher. I think you really showed that something written 50 years later can absolutely add fundamental information about the situation at the time.
Well, thank you, Jim. It means a huge amount coming from you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Let's open it up a little bit, see whether anybody has any questions. Thoughts? Especially here.
Yeah. So one of them that is so striking is the degree to which, and Jeff, you'll have sort of particular expertise on this, the degree to which.
Well, actually, let's, Mark, if you don't mind,
Not at all.
speak into the microphone because we have an online audience.
Yeah, for sure. So, Jeff, having been a presidential speechwriter and understanding how to create sort of a narrative around something, it really is remarkable the degree to which Glenn is sort of, you don't want to use propaganda as a loaded word, but there is sort of a sense that he is a national hero and he's feted, and NASA is famous for having public affairs apparatus that sort of rivaled no other in the federal government, if not in private industry. And so it does seem like there are some lessons today. It's sort of remarkable that we have these series of vaccines. We don't really have a hero. I mean, I think you could argue that it's Fauci, but he's a sort of more controversial figure, and he didn't invent the vaccine. You even look at the 50s, this is happening, just a few years after the polio vaccine, which is, and Salk and Sabin is right, that's a race, a domestic race. But the sort of those personalities still stand out to us today. It's sort of remarkable that we haven't learned that lesson or applied the lessons that you might learn from building a character or persona like Glenn. So can you give us sort of a better sense of what they did, how they thought about that, and maybe what we're missing today as we sort of, I'm sure, and there may be other scientific endeavors that would be worthy of this sort of public affairs veil.
Thanks, Mark. Well, maybe I'll tackle that in two pieces. I mean, one, thinking about how NASA approached the public relations piece of this and how they saw this asset that they had in John Glenn. They certainly were well aware that they had an incredible asset in Glenn and in the astronauts generally. And one of the interesting things that I found is before the names of the astronauts had been released to the public, NASA announced that it had picked 7 guys who were all in their 30s and they were all married and they were all family men. And that was the first thing that NASA wanted the nation and the world to know about these astronauts. Why is that? Well, you could probably write a senior thesis on that question, but I'll give you my take on it. Again, just sort of reading the articles in the period. It was very important for Americans to feel that these weren't supermen. They were, but they were everyman supermen. There was endless commentary in the first few weeks about the fact that we know these guys. I mean, assuming that you are a white middle-class middle American, which is generally the assumption that newspapers in those days were making about their readers. These were characters that you knew. They were guys you went to high school with. They were people that you went to church with, and so on and so forth. And so the answer to America's ills and its failures in the face of the Soviet challenge were going to be solved by a very familiar American type. And we were going to draw deep on what made us most proud of ourselves, not only our manifestations of strength, but kind of deep moral character as middle-class middle Americans understood it. And so Glenn was the most obvious manifestation of this, again, because he could speak to it. Some of the astronauts had marital problems that were sort of papered over. Other astronauts just had absolutely no interest in talking about any of this. But if you watch the very first press conference where the astronauts are introduced to the world at April 1959, they bring them out onto the stage at NASA headquarters. And they all sort of take a bow and they sit down and they have microphones like this in front of them and ashtrays, which we don't have today. And they're asked questions about their personal lives. And Glenn leans forward, literally, and he talks about his wife and he talks about his family and he talks about his faith and he sort of sings a patriotic song. And it's perfectly authentic and people can tell that it is. And the others are sort of leaning to the side, kind of whispering to each other and they're not capable of or interested in playing that game. And so Glenn becomes the one to sort of represent what it is that people want to see in the astronauts and what NASA hopes the public will see in its astronauts. Jumping ahead to why we can't manage that today, I don't think we have any shortage of actual heroes, whether it's Fauci or some of the scientists who developed the vaccines or done anything else that we probably are taking for granted. I think that the problem is that I think we're not capable of unifying around anyone in this moment. I won't climb up on that particular soapbox, but it's just not clear to me that given accomplishments like the ones that we're describing here, that we would treat these characters the same way today that they were treated in this sort of simpler time. And, some of them probably deserved rougher treatment than they got. This is not to say that we're simply supposed to accept whoever NASA or anybody else gives to us and exalt them. But I think that the nation being as divided as it is right now, I think if we're talking about a hero to one side, it's very rarely going to be a hero to the other, and that dynamic did not exist in the early 1960s.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Awesome talk. I appreciate it. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why John Glenn liked a Prinz instead of a Corvette, like everybody else did.
Well, you read very closely, or you knew this already. Well, I'll give a little bit of context. The astronauts, as described, these were test pilots. They like to go very fast, and John Glenn was no different than the rest of them. But the others like to go fast on the ground too. And when they became astronauts, a local Chevrolet dealer let them all lease Corvettes for $1 a year. And so they all hopped into these brand new Corvettes for nothing. It was great publicity for Chevrolet, and they would drag race around the Cape. And Glenn just thought it was all really, really silly. And he didn't really want any part of that. So he bought himself a Prinz, which I had to look up. Maybe you knew what it was, but I didn't. It was a West German micro car. That was how it was described. It got great mileage, which is not something that Alan Shepard thought too much about in his Corvette, was what kind of gas mileage it got. But the Prinz got great mileage, and they made, and by the way, it was mustard yellow. So it was as unsexy a car as anybody could possibly ever put themselves behind the wheel of. And the other astronauts would make a ton of fun of him about it. And so I described this in the book, but they showed up one day for a briefing, and somebody had written on the chalkboard, definition of a sports car, a sign of the male menopause. That was Glenn's retort to these guys who were approaching middle age and just wanted to show off in their sports cars.
Great. Any questions? Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I was wondering if you could talk a little about the apparent decline in interest in space after the Apollo program, and also where that fits in today, if we're seeing a revitalization of that interest, especially with the private sector now taking over.
Great. Well, I'm happy to take a shot at this, but I really, Jim, want to hear your take on this. I think that there are probably a number of reasons for it. Nixon was not as enthusiastic about the space program as Johnson had been, or Kennedy had become. That was certainly the case. But it was also, as I understand it, it was the public having seen a series of successful lunar landings, no longer found them that interesting, or no longer found them that compelling or important relative to things that were either happening or needed to happen here on Earth and here in the United States. And I think that, I mean, for me, and then I will hit pause here because, Jim, I want to get your reaction to this. But I think that part of the problem goes back to a much earlier period in the space program, which is that man in space, as it was inevitably called at the time, was an idea that was often in search of a rationale. In the 1950s, there was a lot of talk about sending men into space, but it was really unclear why that needed to happen at all. And if you ask the military branches, who, as I said before, were each kind of running their own space program, well, the Air Force had this notion that they would have, I don't know, dogfights in space. They had this notion that if, well, we're going to have high-speed combat up there, then we'll do the same thing just up there. And the rationale wasn't, and if the Soviets were going to do it, then we had to do it. So that was part of the rationale. Others were coming up with all sorts of, the Army actually at one point talked about sending convoys of troops via space to the other side of the world, that they would sort of shoot them up in a carrier at the top of, I guess, an ICBM, and they would come down on the other side of the world where they needed to fight quickly. That didn't go very far, that plan. But what's interesting too is that if you shift to the scientific community, there was not actually an enormous amount of support for the idea of sending human beings into space. It was not clear to many scientists that there was anything that a human being could observe in space that some sort of instrument couldn't observe more accurately. If you want to learn about the magnetic fields around the Earth, well, you send a magnetometer up or something. You'll tell me if I got that one right.
You got it.
You don't need to send somebody in a, essentially a diving bell to look out the window and try to observe something that he can't see with his own eyes. And there was also a concern on the part of the scientific community, and this lasted certainly into Mercury, and maybe Jim, you'll tell us much later than that so much money and energy and expertise was going to be absorbed by the effort to send people up and bring them back not dead, that it was going to be drained from other more important scientific activity and exploration here on Earth.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think one of the problems was that basically we began to do science on the moon too. And, that's kind of like, whoa, yawn, what's that all about? And so we thought it was exciting, and indeed it was. But I think the public lost interest from that point of view. And indeed, we could never, ever have justified the Apollo lunar exploration program on the basis of science alone. We never would have done that. And that's part of the budget issue back and forth. It was actually draining money from science, many people believed. We looked upon it as actually a lead forward, okay, to accomplish more science, et cetera. So I think that was a really important dynamic. For me personally, the end of the Apollo program was much more about national priorities and what was going on at the time. So while I was working on getting humans to the moon all my career, working at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., every weekend I would be down protesting the Vietnam War with 100,000 of my closest friends. And it was an incredibly contentious time, okay? And not only that, the cities were burning. There were race riots and things like this. And so, the huge amount of money that was going into Vietnam, it was sucking up the national budget and the priorities, et cetera. And so, attention just drifted away from the space program for, I think, a variety of reasons. Probably the most important were Vietnam and the race riots and which sadly have not gone away. The inattention to those problems. So I think these kinds of endeavors have really paid off. What the astronauts did, these scientific expeditions to the moon, I think have, while we couldn't have justified them initially, have really propelled us on, so that we are going to send humans back. They can accomplish really important things. And I would say the one rationale, Apollo 16 Commander John Young, who is just an amazing, he's an incredible guy, a Georgia guy, the most understated, but the smartest astronaut I think I've ever encountered. Somebody asked him, so why are we doing all this? Why are we going to the moon? He said, well, single planet species don't survive. Think about that, okay? And, the guy, yeah. And so that's another logic and rationale, but that's totally lost on everybody. So I think those were the major factors, and you nailed them down for sure. I'd just like to tell a brief. John Glenn came back to Brown, as I mentioned, to accept an honorary degree after his space flight, at age 77, the oldest human to orbit the Earth and the first American to orbit the Earth. Amazing. It was incredibly. So we had him over at our lab in Lincoln Field Building, and he was so interested in the science. He and Annie came over, and we sat around. We had a bunch of students tell him what they're doing. He was just so excited by it all. And one of the students kind of impertinently said, well, are you going into space again? And his eyes lit up, and he turned to Annie, and she said, no. But the next day, to me personally, it was such a thrill to talk to him, and he was so engaged in everything we were doing. So at the big ceremony, all the honorary degree candidates are lined up along the side, and us faculty in our robes and hats, funny hats, you've seen those, marching down in front of him. And John Glenn catches my eye, and he goes, 2 thumbs up.
Wow.
I'd like to put that on my resume if I can figure out a way to do it. But that's the kind of thing. This guy was totally inspirational, and I think it's the kind of thing that we all felt at the time too. And I think that's been lost. I think we're on to other things. I think you're totally right about the inability to rally around much of anything these days, and so I think that's sad. Maybe that'll change when we have the first woman and the next man on the moon with the Artemis program.
Great. Other questions? I just maybe want to conclude with one question on this point about John Glenn's staying power. As I was reading the book, I was thinking, wow, in 1962, when John Glenn flew Friendship 7, that was a particular, at least in my mind, an image of America, very buttoned down, John Glenn in his bow tie on, game shows, but, it was a really pre-rock and roll America. And then 1969, Apollo 11, year before Bobby Kennedy killed, Martin Luther King killed, as Jim said, race riots, Vietnam, in just that 7 years, a totally different, seemingly, America. And maybe that has something to do with why the Apollo program kind of petered out in the public's imagination. But John Glenn didn't peter out. He somehow managed to stay relevant in his political career and onward, then back into space. How did he do that in these like completely different countries? Almost the guy stays relevant. How?
That's a great question. He did stay relevant, and yet he had to work for it. Glenn, it was when Glenn first walked out onto the stage in 1959 at that press conference that I mentioned, people were already talking about him as a political candidate someday. He just had all the skills, and he had the magnetism, and that talk continued through the Mercury program, and particularly after he did what he did, and the nation and the world really reacted the way that they did. There was the sense that Glenn could be president someday. And yet when he did first, so he left NASA in 1964 for a range of reasons, mainly because it was clear that he wasn't going to get to fly again, as we were discussing before. But the Kennedys had actually been urging him to run for Senate from Ohio. In 1963, both President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy had urged him to do that in 64, but he wasn't ready to leave the program. And but after the assassination of President Kennedy, and after Glenn saw the writing on the wall at NASA, he decided that he was going to leave and he was going to run. And he was beginning the campaign when he slipped in a hotel bathroom and he banged his head on the bathtub so hard that he injured his inner ear. And for the better part of a year, he was barely able to walk. He had no sense of balance, and so he had to drop out of the race. He recovered, but he ran again in 1970, and he lost in the primaries to Howard Metzenbaum, who became a U.S. senator long-serving U.S. senator from Ohio. And it was in that moment that Glenn really had to recognize that all of this love for him and this admiration for him and this celebrity that he had was not automatically going to translate into political leadership. And he needed to think a lot harder about what he stood for besides these kind of gauzy American values. What did he think about this set of issues? He really had not done the work. And so he runs again in 1974 and wins because he has done more of the work. And the thing about Glenn is that he was as hardworking an astronaut off the simulator and off the trainer as he was on them. And the notes that he left in his archives are only just part of the evidence of that. And I was able to draw on that. And so as a senator, he tackled issues with that same sort of discipline. He was not one of these senators who would just sort of wander into a hearing, kind of just turn to staff and say, what are we talking about? There are senators like that. I don't think I'll surprise you by stating that. But Glenn did his homework, and he was a serious-minded legislator. And so he was able to stay relevant on the issues in part. But interestingly, when he did run for president in 1984, and was seen initially for all of these reasons that we've been describing as the strongest potential challenger to President Reagan, and the Reagan White House saw it the same way. It didn't pan out. And why didn't it pan out? Because many of the values that Glenn seemed to represent, he seemed lost a little bit in the past. And the real argument that was happening in that primary sort of happened around him between Gary Hart, who was much younger and representing a different generation of Democrats, and Walter Mondale, who was closer to being a contemporary. He was not quite a contemporary of Glenn's, but also had sort of different strengths. And so Glenn did not seem so relevant in that race. And having lost early on, retreated to the Senate to again reestablish his relevance as a legislator in the way that we're talking about.
Fantastic. I was reminded, of course, we have an online audience, and I think we have some questions from the online audience.
Yep. Hey, everyone. So this is from our online questions. Is there a history? Is this history that you've presented have a rhyme in the present? Is there a way to organize around a new challenge? Global climate change, maybe? How can we make that happen again?
Really important question. I think we're having a hard enough time organizing around space, which is less controversial, should be, than some of the changes that are required to really tackle the climate change problem. I think that if there is any problem that the world is facing right now that requires that same marshaling of energy, to turn back again to those words of James Webb, how a great nation or how great nations solve a great problem, it would be that one. But again, the environment is very different. And I think that at the same time, I think there are some lessons to be drawn here. And it's not simply the lesson is, I don't want the lesson or the takeaway to be, we can never recreate those conditions, so we're not capable of doing these kinds of things today. I don't believe that. I am ultimately more optimistic than that. But one of the ways that I find that optimism is to go back into this history and to see how contingent it all was, how difficult it all was. The fact that when John Kennedy, we remember the bold challenge that he issued the nation, that we would go to the moon by the end of the decade and bring people safely back to Earth, that there was not an immediate rallying around that idea by the public. And interestingly, and I hadn't known this until I began working on this, when Kennedy gave that speech in late May 1961, he reads the lines in the speech. He's in Congress, so very formal setting, and he's reading the speech. And then he departs from a script, and you can go on YouTube and you can watch him do this. And he looks up and he begins to kind of nervously shuffle the papers and rearrange them a little bit. And he starts saying a lot. And he starts kind of riffing uncomfortably and saying, essentially, look, this is going to be really expensive and this is going to be really hard. And you, the Congress, and you, the American public, need to think really hard about whether we're up for this, because the worst thing would be for us to start down this road and then decide somewhere along the way that we're not willing to get there. And so this is going to be challenging. And he got then, after the speech, in the limo to go back to the White House, and he turned to his speechwriter, Ted Sorensen, and he said effectively, I don't think I sold it. I was reading the room. I was looking at, and he could see that the members of Congress were not persuaded. And the polls that were taken around that time put a very low priority. The American people put a very low priority on going to the moon, on spending the kind of money that it was going to take to go to the moon. So we look back at it very differently today. And the moonshot is always posited as the thing, and it is an example of the nation deciding to do something incredibly difficult and succeeding. And yet, what I wanted to show here in this book is that these things aren't smooth or easy or obvious at the time. And that the work was done to make it happen in that environment, despite a whole fleet of challenges coming at Kennedy. And so we have no real choice but to continue to try to do that work when it comes to a challenge as global and as generational as climate.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. Maybe it gets back to your question. I mean, I believe Kennedy looked at, and what he was looking at is a bunch of white male old guys. Looking at one right here. But the key was, who heard that? It's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of effort. Can we do it? We're not even sure we can do it. We heard it as 20 somethings and we did it. I mean, Jack Schmidt always says Apollo 13. He told me, I said, that was a great movie. He said, well, yeah, there was one thing wrong with it. I said, what was that? All the actors in Mission Control were too old. They were all in their 20s. And I said, you're right. I didn't turn 30 till Apollo 16, I think. You know what I mean? And so those are the people that were brought in. Okay. And, they accepted the challenge. Maybe that's the way we get back and, have the youth of the America be attracted to exploration in the broader sense and see it as a challenge. And maybe that's how we recreate this. You can't recreate things too, but nonetheless, I think bringing the energy that America shows when there's a challenge is one of our strengths, and I think it will happen again. So I hope.
Well, on that note, history rhymes. I hope it rhymes in that fashion. So let me thank you all for your great questions, and especially Jeff Shesol. I want to thank you for this appearance, but really for writing such a terrific book, Mercury Rising. Again, I recommend it to everybody. And Jim Head, I also especially want to thank you for all that you've done and for leading us today in this great discussion.
Thank you.
Superb.
Great.
Great. And of course, thanks to our online audience as well. May we all be together in greater numbers soon.
Okay.
Thanks for turning out in person.
Do we have a book signing up back?
Yeah, that's right. And we have books
I'm your
outside, I
agent
believe, so we can do some book signings.
great. Thank you.
All right. That was fantastic,
Yeah.
phenomenal, really fun. Wow. I would love to go on for hours. I'm
Yeah, sorry, that's my
huge
fault. I
space
do.
nut. Well, nothing.
Sorry I talk so much, but it was really, you
No, no,
you
I
pushed
would-
all kinds